Welcome to the Deep Dive, everyone. Today we're taking a look at something pretty unique. We're going to be exploring Donald Trump's political journey, but with a twist.
A twist.
Yeah. We've got this source, right? And it dives into what it claims is his second term as president. The catch, it wasn't back-to-back.
Ah, you mean non-consecutive.
Exactly. Not consecutive, meaning after his first term from 2017 to 2021, he, lost the election. But then, according to this source, he came back and won again in 2024. The last time something like this happened was with Grover Cleveland way back in the 1800s.
It's certainly an unusual situation to find ourselves in, having a source that essentially predicts a future presidency.
Right. It's almost like reading a history book, but from the future.
It really makes you wonder, what can we actually learn from a source that speculates on events that haven't even happened yet?
That's what we're here to find out. But before we jump into all that, let's rewind a bit.
Yeah.
Everyone knows Donald Trump, right? But he wasn't always a politician.
Absolutely. Before stepping into the political arena, he was a prominent businessman, a real estate mogul, and let's not forget, a reality TV star.
Oh, yeah, The Apprentice. I remember that show. You're fired. Classic.
So he was already a very public figure, familiar to many even before his political aspirations took shape.
So, okay, he transitions from boardrooms to the Oval Office, becomes president in 2017, and serves his first term until 2021. What were some of the defining moments of that period?
Well, his first term was marked by significant policy shifts, to say the least. Tax cuts, major changes to immigration policies, withdrawal from international agreements.
Oh, and don't forget the Supreme Court appointments.
Yeah, absolutely, the Supreme Court appointments. Those have long-lasting implications, shaping the judicial landscape for years to come. And of course, there were the two impeachments.
Two impeachments. Unprecedented. That's never happened before in U.S. history. It was a pretty turbulent time in American politics.
Absolutely turbulent. His policies, the judges he appointed, they continue to have a ripple effect on the U.S. even today. And then, of course, there was the 2020 election.
Ah, yes, the 2020 election. The loss to Joe Biden. And let's be honest, he didn't exactly accept those results gracefully, did he?
No, he didn't. That was another unprecedented moment, this challenge to the peaceful transfer of power, something that had always been a cornerstone of American democracy.
Right, a very controversial election, to put it mildly. So this brings us to our source, this intriguing document that claims to lay out what happens next. What does it say about the 2024 election?
Well, according to the source, Trump announces his candidacy, secures the Republican nomination.
Meaning he becomes the official Republican candidate for president.
Exactly. And then he goes head-to-head with Kamala Harris, the Democratic candidate. And, get this, the source predicts that Trump wins. He returns to the White House for a second term.
Wow, that's quite the prediction. But why? What does the source say led to this outcome? What factors contributed to this supposed victory?
Well, the source highlights a few key issues that seem to resonate with voters. Border security emerges as a prominent theme.
Border security. Okay, that makes sense, considering his past stance on immigration.
Right. Then there's the economy, always a major factor in any election. And interestingly, the source points to a perceived threat from what it calls the radical left.
Radical left. That's a term that can be interpreted in various ways. What exactly does the source mean by that? We'll need to delve into that a bit further. But beyond these issues, what about Trump himself? Why did people choose to vote for him again, according to this prediction?
Well, the source paints a picture of a segment of the population that felt overlooked, forgotten even. They felt that the political establishment, the career politicians were out of touch with their struggles, their concerns. But Trump, they felt, was different.
Different how?
They perceived him as someone who understood their frustrations, someone who spoke their language, someone who, in their eyes, was a fighter, a champion for their cause.
So, this source is suggesting that Trump tapped into a sense of disillusionment among certain voters, a feeling that he, unlike others, genuinely understood their concerns.
That's precisely what it seems to be saying. It suggests that this connection, this perceived understanding, played a crucial role in his supposed return to power. Welcome back to our deep dive. We're still unraveling this prediction about Donald Trump's second term as president. It's, like peeking into a crystal ball, isn't it? Like last time we were discussing his first term and that surprising, alleged victory in the 2024 election, according to our source.
Yeah, that source is something else. So it claims Trump wins against Kamala Harris, and it talks about these issues that helped him, supposedly win. Border security, the economy, and then there was that phrase, the radical left. What does that even mean in this context?
You're right. The term radical left, it's loaded. It can have different meanings depending on who you ask. But it's important to remember we're just looking at what the source says, how it uses this term. And here it seems to be referring to, well, individuals or groups with very progressive viewpoints.
Progressive, meaning?
Progressive, in this context, refers to people who advocate for significant, often rapid, societal changes. They might support things like universal health care.
Universal health care, that's where everyone have access to health care, regardless of their income, right?
Exactly. But the source is suggesting that this label, radical left, became a sort of rallying point for some voters who saw these progressive ideas as perhaps too extreme.
So they voted for Trump because they were afraid of these changes.
That's what the source seems to be implying. It suggests that these voters felt threatened by what they perceived as radical shifts in societal norms and values.
Okay, so that's one side of the coin. But, I mean, obviously not everyone was thrilled about this supposed victory. What does the source say about, well, the people who weren't exactly celebrating Trump's return?
The source describes a nation deeply divided, split almost down the middle. On one hand, there were those who rejoiced at Trump's return, but on the other hand, there were those who were deeply troubled, those who disagreed with his policies and were, well, frankly, quite concerned about his leadership style.
Let's break that down a bit. Let's start with the policies. What were some of the specific things that people were apprehensive about?
Immigration was a big one, a major point of contention. The source says that Trump doubled down on border security, strengthening the border between the U.S. and Mexico. He basically wanted to, curtail illegal immigration. And it also became much tougher for people to immigrate legally as well.
Right. That was a hallmark of his first term, too, the wall, remember? And all those changes to the legal immigration system. Some folks were all for it, but others, well, they felt it was just too harsh, too extreme.
Exactly. Critics argued that these policies lacked compassion, that they were inhumane, tearing families apart and making it nearly impossible for people to seek asylum.
Asylum. That's when someone flees their own country because it's dangerous and they ask for protection in another country. Right.
Precisely. But beyond immigration, there were concerns about other policies as well.
Like?
Well, the economy was another hot-button issue. The source indicates that Trump pretty much continued the economic policies he'd implemented during his first term. Tax cuts for businesses and, wealthier individuals. And he also scaled back regulations.
Regulations. Those are basically rules that the government sets for businesses, right? I mean, at first glance, cutting taxes and easing regulations, it kind of sounds like a good thing. Why the concern?
Well, critics argued that these measures primarily benefited the wealthy, that ordinary people didn't really see any tangible improvements in their lives. And then there was the environmental impact, or the potential for it. Less regulation, it can sometimes mean more pollution, more environmental damage.
So there were worries about both the economic and environmental consequences of these policies.
Precisely. It wasn't just about the immediate effects, it was about the long-term implications as well.
Okay, so immigration, the economy, those are big ones. What else? Anything else that raised eyebrows?
Oh, yes. Foreign policy. The source claims that Trump continued with his America First agenda.
America First. Yeah, that was the central theme of his first term. Basically, prioritizing American interests, even if it ruffled some feathers on the international stage. How did that play out, supposedly play out in this second term?
Well, in practice, it meant that the U.S. continued to back away from certain international agreements, like the Paris Climate Accord, the one focused on reducing pollution and combating climate change. And there were trade wars.
Trade wars, basically when countries slap tariffs on each other's goods, making them more expensive, right?
Exactly. It becomes an economic tit for tat. And the source suggests that these trade wars, they created a lot of friction, disrupted global trade, and ended up hurting businesses worldwide.
So America First meant putting American interests front and center, even if it meant straining relationships with other countries.
That's the essence of it. And predictably, it generated a lot of tension. Some people applauded it, felt it was about time America stood up for itself. But others, they worried it would isolate the U.S., damage its global standing.
Okay, so we've got immigration, the economy, foreign policy, all these areas where people were at odds with Trump's agenda. But the source also mentions his leadership style. What do people have to say about that?
Many people, especially his critics, were really troubled by his rhetoric.
The way he speaks, the words he uses.
Exactly. He often used very strong language, sometimes even inflammatory language. He frequently attacked his opponents, and he made statements that were, undeniably divisive.
Yeah, he was known for being, shall we say, outspoken, Didn't really hold back, even if it meant stirring the pot.
Precisely. And that's the thing. Some people admired that about him. They saw it as honesty, as authenticity, as someone who, well, wasn't afraid to speak his mind, even if it ruffled feathers. But for others, it was alarming. They saw it as dangerous, as potentially inciting violence and hatred.
So it seems his leadership style was just as polarizing as his policies, loved by some, loathed by others.
That sums it up pretty well. The source really paints a picture of a nation deeply fractured, torn apart by these fundamental disagreements, a very tumultuous period indeed.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into, well, this speculative look at Donald Trump's second term as president. We've been following this source, this prediction, if you will. We've talked about the policies, that alleged win in 2024, and of course the mixed reactions here in America.
Right, a nation divided, as they say. But, we focused a lot on the domestic scene, the impact within the U.S. But what about the rest of the world? How did other countries react to this hypothetical second Trump presidency?
That's a good point. I mean, America's decisions, its actions, they don't happen in a vacuum. What happens here often has ripple effects across the globe. So what does our source say about the global response?
Well, the source suggests that the international community, well, they weren't exactly singing from the same hymn sheet. It was a mixed bag, some countries expressing concern, others perhaps a bit more optimistic.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. Let's start with the apprehensive folks. Why were some countries worried about Trump's return?
Well, a lot of it stemmed from his America First agenda. Remember that focus on prioritizing American interests, even if it meant, well, potentially jeopardizing relationships with other nations.
Right. We discussed how he pulled out of international agreements, engaged in trade wars. Did that pattern continue in this second term, according to the source?
It seems so. The source suggests that he maintained that focus on, well, on American interests above all else. And that made some countries nervous, especially those who had relied on, well, on U.S. support in the past. They saw it as America turning inward, becoming more isolationist.
Isolationist, meaning?
Basically, withdrawing from global affairs, focusing more on domestic issues, and being less engaged, less involved in international collaborations.
So some countries were worried about being left out in the cold, losing that American backing. But were there any countries that actually saw Trump's return as a positive?
Interestingly, yes. Some countries, it seems, actually welcomed this America First approach. They saw it as a shift away from what they perceived as American interventionism.
Interventionism, basically
Yeah.
getting involved in other countries' business, right?
Exactly. Some countries felt that in the past, America had been a bit too heavy-handed, meddling in their affairs. They preferred Trump's more hands-off approach, saw it as well as respecting their sovereignty.
So a difference in perspective. Some saw America First as abandonment, others as a welcome change from perceived interference. Interesting. But what about specific global issues like climate change, for instance, or international trade? Did those areas see any impact?
Well, the source indicates that there were, some bumps in the road. For example, Trump's decision to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement, that certainly didn't help the global effort to combat climate change.
Yeah, if one of the world's biggest polluters isn't on board, it makes it that much harder to achieve those climate goals.
Precisely. And then there were the trade wars. The source suggests that those continued disrupting global trade networks, causing economic uncertainty, and, ultimately hurting businesses in many countries.
So a bit of a mixed bag on the global stage, too. America First resonated with some, alienated others, and created some pretty significant ripples in areas like climate change and international trade.
That's a pretty fair assessment. It seems Trump's second term, at least according to this prediction, was just as impactful, just as controversial on the world stage as it was domestically.
Well, there you have it. A glimpse into a possible future. A speculative look at what a second Trump presidency might have entailed. The policies, the political climate, the global response. It's been a fascinating, if somewhat unsettling journey. But it's important to remember, this is just one interpretation, one possible version of events.
Absolutely. The future is always uncertain. But exploring these possibilities, these what-ifs, it helps us understand the potential ramifications of our choices, the paths we might take, and the world we might create.
And on that note, we wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, everyone. We hope you found this exploration thought-provoking, maybe even a little bit mind-bending. Until next time.